Welcome to the second lecture of our course in federal government. And let's continue discussing another category of population that will play an important role in the early colonial period and then, in the history of the United States in terms of its legacy. In order to do that, we need to talk about the slave trade, right, and the institution of slavery. Now, what we here, because the United States, again, has a particular history in this regard, we here need to differentiate conceptually between slavery and racism or racial discrimination, which are two different things. Slavery is a commercial relationship in a way, right? That has existed throughout history, and it's not related to race or ethnicity or anything in itself, right? So we have had slavery in ancient Greece, where Greeks would, have slaves other Greeks, right? So Athens, when it was an empire, city-state that was an empire, and that became an empire, went around conquering, and famously, went to the island of Melos. And after conquering it, it killed, the winners, the conquerors, the Athenians, killed all the male and enslaved all the women and children, right? So their slaves were Greek. You could not be able to tell them apart except for the roles that they played, right? Same later on and in the Roman Empire. And, if we get to the time of the colonial period, what you have, for example, in Africa, you have slavery, right? You have slavery in the sense of, some Africans enslaving other African tribes, conquering other tribes and enslaving their people. So now it's an abominable institution in itself, right? Owning people like as they were objects, right? It's dehumanizing. But slavery as such is not related to race. So the question becomes, how does it become associated with race in the United States, and how it gets meshed up with the racial prejudice and racial discrimination, so that later we have issues resulting from racial discrimination. So let's start talking about the slave trade. Well, even before talking about the slave trade, remember we talked about the fact that the part of the key to the success of the colonies was the influx of people, and especially for the southern colonies, which were more agricultural. Agriculture at that time being done, success in agriculture being predicated on more land and more people means more income, right? Because it was extensive agriculture, right? You needed more space and more people to collect what grew on that area. That was the key to your success. Today it's not the same, because today we're talking about intensive agriculture, right? We're higher productivity, per square feet, to put it that way, and we have all the tools of modern agriculture, right? So you don't need, it's not the number of people, you still need people, but it's not the number of people that gives the success, the key to the success. So anyway, from the beginning, the colonies, were interested in having more people, and as I said, the southern colonies in having work hands to work these, lands, because the more land you have, the more people you had to work the lands, the richer you were. At first, from the beginning, you had people who were coming from England and work on those lands, and some of them, a good number of these people came as indentured servants. Indentured servitude was an institution by which, if you went into serious debt, you were either sent to jail, or a better alternative was that you were basically entered servanthood for a number of years, like let's say 7 years. You had to work out your debt. So many of these indentured servants were sent or came to the colonies in North America, the British colonies, to pay off their debt, and they were indentured servants for a number of years. Not exactly like slavery, but kind of the same relationship, because it was forced labor in many ways. Yeah. And then you have the slave trade. Now, the slave trade was, again, let's focus on Africa at this point. The way it worked was that different interested parties went and bought slaves from local rulers from Africa, who sold the slaves to the Europeans. The Europeans didn't really go in and catch slaves. I mean, it didn't have the resources and the tools, and it was cheaper and more effective for them to go to these slave markets on the coast and bought the slaves from African rulers. In fact, and you know, this slave trade went in different directions. In fact, the biggest slave trading historically, the largest number of slaves from Africa bought this way and taken away, actually did not go to North America, not even to the Caribbean, but actually went to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the largest slave importer, so to speak. From Africa, because it was right there, right? It was in North Africa. It was much closer, and they imported, I mean, in numbers incomparable to the numbers of slaves that were brought to the West Indies, to the Caribbean, which was kind of the second in number, or to the northern colonies, which was sort of the third in number. Now, again, none of this, you know, takes away the, you know, the abominable nature of the institution of slavery, as I said, but at this point, it's you're buying people to, you know, to work, you know, on your lands, and they become property. But at the same time, this being a commercial relationship, this commercial relationship could also be dissolved. So, for example, the British will pass laws by which, you know, when the slaves would convert to Christianity, they would become free, right? Because again, it's a commercial relationship. Any commercial relationship can be made and unmade. And so in the beginnings of the slave trade to North America, you know, you would have formerly African slaves who became free, and then themselves they became owners of slaves, or Indians who were slaves or owners of slaves, right? So it was a commercial relationship. Now, how does this become, again, not good, not, you know, if we still an abominable institution in itself, right? Which is also why the British started to kind of abolish it. But what is the process through which this becomes associated intrinsically with this concept of race? Race, which is, by the way, a made-up concept, doesn't really exist. Yeah, there's no such thing as race, even by the definition. There is no actual content to it's a made-up thing. Yeah. So how can you made-up concept? Because, you know, the color of skin or anything doesn't make, you know, doesn't mean that if someone is, it's like has a color of the skin or whatever, that they have a specific culture or whatever, right? Because, you know, it's like saying someone is tall, then they are better at playing the violin. It's like, makes no sense. And it doesn't work, right? So race becomes this, you know, made-up concept. But anyway, at what point it becomes associated with slavery, and why? Well, part of the process, you know, besides human prejudice, which is always, you know, present, and remember where we're leaving from, right? So at a certain point, you have, you know, free blacks. You had blacks who were formerly from Africa, right? Who were enslaved. So, you know, it was a mix. So when does this change radically? So part of the process was the fact that in Britain there was a strong push towards abolishing slavery. In fact, Britain will be the power that will abolish slavery, not just in terms of taking part in the slave trade, but they will also pass legislation by which they will mandate their own navy to stop the slave trade in Africa. Right, the slave trade that was done between, you know, different powers coming to buy slaves from local, you know, tribes and rulers in Africa, to stop that. And it was the British Empire that put an end to the slave. I mean, that to a large degree ended the slave trade in Africa. And this push came, you know, was a strong push that came from the cultural ethos, from the Christian ethos of the British culture at that time. Where, you know, the whole concept of slavery it was perceived as abominable. Also, this is, you remember, I mentioned that you know, one of the earlier pieces of legislation was if a slave converts to Christianity, they should be freed, right? Because again, the idea of being equal, you know, being created equal, you know, being all children of God doesn't really work with the idea of slavery when a human being becomes an object and not a child of God, right? According to, you know, the Christian outlook. So now, okay, so that's happening in Britain. There's this push, and there's this, you know, act that push towards abolishing slavery. You know, slowly and gradually they will get there. But that doesn't happen also in the colonies, because the colonies were not interested in abolishing the institution of slavery because of economic reasons. So one of the earlier pieces of legislation that kind of shows you how this moved towards associating two concepts that are not related, one of them which is made up, the concept of race, was, for example, in the 1660s when Maryland passes a law by which not only the current people of African descent who are slaves, but also their descendants, that also their children. So basically, slavery becomes genetic. So it becomes an you inherited by birth, which makes completely no sense, of course, right? Because again, one is the commercial relationship. You don't inherit a commercial relationship, right? It's absurd. Based on what? But this was a way of sort of creating a category that is stuck in this status. Although, as I said, at this point, there were, free blacks, and depending on where they were. Like, you go to the southern coast of Mississippi, to the Gulf Coast, and you see even historically that the blacks who were there, most of them were free blacks, because, in fishing, you don't really, that's not a slavery-intensive institution, right? But you go a little bit north in Mississippi, and you see the history of slavery in terms of most African Americans being, well, those brought from Africa being slaves, because on those lands you needed slavery. So, it varied from place to place according to economic needs. But as I said, Maryland and then New York and New Jersey, Carolina, Virginia would then pass these laws associating, slavery with, connecting slavery genetically. So making it so that not just the current slaves, but also their descendants remain slaves. And this will have any significant role in reinforcing, prejudices, in creating, again, reinforcing this made-up category of race in which, someone of, again, different race is, of a different status, and so on, and will create all the problems in U.S. History that we talked about. But at the same time, you also have in the colonies the same push that you had in England, right? Also from the same sources, from the Christian impetus. And even later, when you have the abolition of slavery and the Civil War and everything, it will come from the same, Christian, a lot of Christian, Puritan Christian movements were pushing towards that. So even as early as 1712, the Pennsylvania Assembly will ban the import of slaves into the colonies. So as early as 1712, and so on. So this is the background for this this other important category of population in the colonies, and it's important to kind of have the background for the Native Americans and for the categories of population who will become slaves, because you need to understand their specific relationship with of these categories with the colonies, with the British colonies, but which is not the same as their relationship with Britain itself, right? Even if that was so to speak mediated through the colonies, but their status, let's say, in Britain, or how Britain saw them, was not the same as how the British colonies in North America saw them. This is important as we get further. Okay, so moving on, talking about the the colonial life, and the question we'll have to ask. Okay, we have 13 colonies, and you should know be able to, list these 13 initial colonies, for example, on the test. And how do we move from these 13 British colonies to what later we will call the United States? And in order to to understand the radical nature of this transformation, or of the processes that will happen over a very short period of time, we need to remind ourselves that how did these colonials, how did the population of these British colonies, how did they see themselves, right? If we were to think of their identity, right? So what were they? Well, first of all, they were British, yeah. So and I'm saying they were British because Britishness at this point meant quite a lot. Because being British meant that at that point that you were part of a population that had political and civil rights that were incomparable to the population of most other countries, for example, in Europe, right? So being British was sort of an attractive, a cool, a trendy thing, was regarded as something very advanced, yeah? Because, for example, the British had a parliament. had a parliament that by this time is more powerful than the monarch, and a parliament that was supposed to represent the British the population of Britain. Well, not remember that representation is not the same as voting. I'm not saying that everybody had the right to vote, everybody voted, or any such thing, but the parliament was made of representatives of the British population, and it was the parliament that had most power of ruling over them. So at this point, being a British person meant that you had certain rights, certain political status that was quite elevated. You were ruled by a parliament more than you were ruled by the monarch, because the parliament was more powerful. You had your representatives in the parliament, right? Even if you didn't have the right to vote, but you had your representatives in the parliament, and so on. Now, this understanding of themselves, this understanding this political self-understanding and cultural self-understanding was also shared by the British colonies, right? The population of the British colonies. And this is important because when we will get to the frictions between them and the government in Britain, a lot of these friction will come from the fact that they will claim to be mistreated as British citizens, as British subjects, right? Now, they were British, so they were British. But, however, although they were British, by this time we have about a century and a half of presence in North America, right? So you have generation after generation being born here. So besides this British dimension of their identity, there was also distinctiveness or distinct aspect of their identity, right? Because they have developed certain things that were specifically theirs, right? There was a sense of a freedom that came from the fact that they were so far from the center of power in Britain, and from the center of power in Britain, and so that allowed them to kind of do whatever they wanted at a certain point. So there was this sense of freedom, as I said. For example, in the 17th century, which was the most troublesome century in British history, at a certain points there was no monarch, blah, blah, blah. The control over the colonies became weak, so they kind of could do whatever they wanted. For example, they traded kind of with whoever they wanted internationally, although they weren't supposed to, because simply it was easier to just let them do whatever they wanted, and harder to enforce by the British government to enforce certain controls on trade and so on. So they got used to kind of doing what they wanted. They also had their own government, as I mentioned, right? They had their self-government. Let's as I mentioned, each colony had its own institutions of government. What are institutions of government? Any institution of government needs to have three functions. Yeah, needs to be able to pass rules, to enforce the rules, and to adjudicate rules. Meaning, to pass rules, make laws. We call them usually laws. They can be called anything, other words as well. You need to be the government needs to be able to pass laws, then to enforce these laws, and then to also adjudicate, right, arbitrate when there are conflicts about the application of the laws, and these three functions are usually, the legislative function, the executive function, and the judicial function. Now, these functions can be played by any sort of combination of institutions. They can all rest in one person, right? You have an absolute ruler who makes rules, enforces the rules, and is also the judge supreme, right? So now, in the colonies, based on the British model, because in Britain, what did you have? You have a parliament, which was most powerful. You have a monarch, which was the head of the executive. Although you also had the prime minister. Let's not go into the details there. And the parliament passed the laws on the British people in Britain, and the executive enforced the laws. Yeah. So the same in the colonies, similar. In the colonies, they had an assembly that was representative, yeah, who represented the population, yeah, and who passed laws over this population. So the members of a colony were represented in the assembly, yeah. Of course, not all of them had the right to vote and so on. And this assembly of representatives passed laws in that colony, right? And then there was a governor who was the head of the executive branch, which is in charge with implementing laws. And if the assembly was elected by the, well, not wasn't elected, it was represented the members of the colony, right? The assembly. It was made of representatives of the population of the colony. The governor was appointed from Britain by the monarch, right? So that's what made them colonies, right? Because the head of the executive got its authority from the head of the executive in Britain, while the legislature was local. So this is how. And then the governor had council that he, right? It was male. Usually, a council that the governor appointed, yeah, to help him govern, yeah, govern meaning to implement the laws and to take care of the daily business, yeah, which is what the executive branch does. Executives do. Executive institutions. So notice how each colony then it has its own institutions of government, as I said, right? But at the same time are connected institutionally with the home country, with Britain, yeah? Which is normal because the colonies are nothing else but the projection of the state, of the British state across the ocean, right? To a different continent, right? And but what was granted to them based on the British rights was the right to self-governance to a degree, to pass legislation that only concerned, you know, the business of the colonies, hence having their own assembly. Right? Normally, you know, even having that is a lot, right? So they had these institutions of self-government that you know allowed them to self-govern, and this assembly also was the institution that not only passed laws but also had the right to collect and then, you know, needed and did collect taxes from the population of the colony. And by the way, them having these institutions of self-governance also was one of the reasons why the colonies were so successful compared to their how the British colonies were so successful compared to their rivals, to the French and to the Spanish, because they had a set of institutions, right? So remember we looked at this map last time. Of the North America around 1750, right? So here's how it looks, right? So these are claims, right? Spanish claims, French claims, and British claims to the territory. Now, all of all these patches of color, of course, only this part is actually solidly populated, as we discussed, and populated with societies, full, real societies, right? While this is most, you know, it's just claimed on paper, the only place where this actually, the French actually were, you know, a society at what is today, you know, state of Louisiana, and what is today in Canada, Quebec, and in the middle they had the roots of merchants and of transit and of transportation along the Mississippi from Quebec to you know, today's southern Louisiana, right? So this middle part, which was not populated by the French, right? They had forts. You see the names of the forts here to protect these routes of commerce. Yeah. So so what do you have? So you don't have institutions here, right? You don't have institutions that will ensure permanence to those societies, and you only have institutions and full societies here. Same with the Spanish in North America. Mostly what they had, notice, is missions, san, yeah, and forts. Yeah, again, we talked about this, and again, that's those are not institutions that maintain a society, right? Those are, you know, they are temporary and very specifically aimed at, you know, either, you know, fighting wars or you know, converting people to Christianity, serving locally, but they are not the skeleton that maintains a political entity. This is why these were the, you know, except for, with some exceptions, you know, like southern Louisiana, as I said, and Quebec, and um, only these here were full real colonies, yeah, because they had a society and they had political institutions that controlled and that defined each colony, right? That gave that colony its an entity, yeah, because each colony existed just like states. The colony exists because there's a set of institutions that govern that colony, right? Now, of course, these institutions were not sovereign, right? Because they didn't have sole power of rule over the colony, right? Because this power was delegated from England, and their institutions were actually depended on the institutions of government in England, and the governor was appointed from the monarch, and on and on. So the power they had was delegated, so to speak, from Britain. They had limited power of control. Overall, overarching power belonged to the government in Britain. Yeah. So they're not sovereign. However, each colony had their own institution of government. So that's what makes, that's what allows for these colonies to not just exist at a certain moment, but to persist in time. Yeah. So that each of them has its government with, as I said, with control over a territory. So much so that when you go north or south from each colony, you will encounter the sphere of action of another set of institutions. Yeah, this is why we have 13 colonies, because we have 13 sets of governing institutions. Okay, what else made them distinct? They made them distinct was this, to a degree, was a specific role that the economic concerns played in the very ethos of the colonies. Because from the beginning, right, economic success has been embedded into the very ethos of being a colonist, and it became a primordial and primary concern, overarching concern. So much so that later on, when we're going to read the Articles of Confederation, we're going to read the U.S. Constitution, and you'll see that the concern with economic success is embedded in these fundamental pieces of legislation, in these fundamental documents of the states that will form, which is not true for every country or any country around the world. And even today, we all recognize that this concern with economic success, with making money, with being rich, and also in many ways the admiration we have for people who are economically successful and how they stand in the public eye, the prominence of rich people, we pay attention to them. This is very American. And for example, if you go to and live in France, just as an example, and again from using our comparative perspective, and always whenever we compare things with, it's not to say that one is better, one is worse. That's up to you to make your judgment. But we need to understand that things can be different, right? And that's kind of our engagement, our mission in this course, to look at this political system that we inhabit, as it were, from the outside, being helped by seeing how things are done elsewhere, or how they were done at a different time, still in America. So if you go to France and live in France, you turn on the TV, and you have guests coming in to give their opinion, or to comment on things, or to give their pieces of wisdom. You will see that the people who are highly regarded and sort of listened to very often are writers, are poets, philosophers, right? You would never get a poet being invited to on American TV to kind of give his opinion about the state of the affairs in the United States. We never had that in America, in the United States. This has never been the function of the we never regarded them, never held them in this high regard in this sense, because it's simply these are cultural differences. Or the first president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic, after they got rid of communism after 1989, was a playwright, Václav Havel, right? A writer of plays, yeah, and he used to write plays against the communist regime, and then he became the first president. But because he was valued for his wisdom, and that guy was associated with his status as a writer, it was associated with the idea that writers are wiser, Now we don't have that, right? We're going to listen to, and we're going to want to see, what does Elon Musk say? So what does Jeff Bezos say? What does whatever other rich guys, would that be Bill Gates or whoever else what do they say, right? We kind of value differently. So this concern with economy, economic success, this value that we put on that, which also goes back to, you know, what Max Weber, famous author, you know, talked about, you know, he connected capitalism with the Protestant spirit, right? He said that these are connected, and Protestantism has helped valuing economic success and so on. You can read up on that if you want. So anyway, there is also, this is a distinctive, becomes a distinctive trait of the perhaps more so than back home, of these British colonies. Another thing that is distinctive for that is this the expansiveness, the expansive ethos of the colonies, because it was in their DNA from the beginning that they needed to expand. Yeah, from the beginning, expansion was in their DNA, because expansion was the key to success, right? So expansion, both in the sense of moving westward, right, because more land meant growth, meant more success, and also in terms of bringing more people in. Because bringing more people in was a key to the success of a colony, because the bigger the population, the richer you can get. Yeah. So, this expansiveness is also part of the DNA of the colonies. So all of these, what I'm trying to say, and I'm just pointing out just some things. So these were British, yeah, the population of the colonies. They were British because, you know, they belonged to the British Empire and so on, and were proud of being British, and, you know, culturally and you know, politically, this gave them sets of rights that were, you know, outstanding. But also they developed traits, yeah, and other, you know, customs and habits that had to do with the fact that, well, they're far away still from Britain. They had a history of self-governance, and had a degree of freedom that was higher probably than back home, because simply the control was harder to impose from then on. You had this whole space where you had the impetus of expanding, and so on and so on. Now, why do I say this? Because we need again to ask, how do we move from this being British and a little bit something else, but, you know, British essentially, because remember, you know, Britain will become a worldwide empire, so you'll have British people throughout the world, and still they remain British, right? For example, later on in India, you will have the British Raj, and you'll have British people who live there and get married there, or even are born there, and yet they remain British, and they will not form a colony there. And so on. So how does all of this move from being British to then refusing the connection or cutting the connection with Britain, yeah, to which you belong? So in order to see this transformation and to follow this transformation, we will list some of the factors that will lead this. And actually the first moment, which is also a factor in this process of moving from colonies to independent states, one of the first moments and also factor in this process will be the French and Indian War. The French So the French and Indian War, which was what, right? So let's think logically. Why is it called the French and Indian War? What could it denote? What could it mean? Well, it was a conflict between the colonies and on the one side, and the French and the Indians on the other side, i.e. the French and the Native American populations on the other side. Now, why were these the two sides? Why were the French and the Native Americans on the same side? Well, quite obviously, right, if you look at the map and we're talking about expansion, we're going to see that as soon as we expand a little bit, right, what do we see, right? We bump into two different populations who at this point will be united by the same cause. As the colonies expand, they will bump into the territories that the French claimed where they had forts, which were their trade routes, right? And also, the more you expand, the more you get to ancestral lands of the Native American tribes. You know, it's one thing to encounter them randomly or smaller groups or, you know, roaming and you encounter them. Another thing is to get to sort of, you keep pushing them and you get to their ancestral lands. So when you try to push them out, it inevitably results in conflict. So this is why it was the French and Indian War happened. It was part of the clash between this impetus, this expansive impetus and ethos of the colonies, and the interests that opposed them, which were of the Native Americans who lived there. And remember, the French, who did not push the Native Americans out of this territory, yeah, but who traded with the Native Americans from this territory. Because remember, the French only really established societies here and here. So the fact that they only had forts and traded with them, the Native Americans were not necessarily threatened by the French, contrary to the expansion of these colonies, right? So this is how you have this conflict. Now, France has a standing army, has a trained army. Colonies don't have such a thing, right? So what do? They need to, who's going to fight the war for them? Regular people, militias, and so on. Each of them with their own guns. That's not going to resist, not going to be able to face the French ordered army and trained army. So it's the British troops, yeah, their troops, the troops of Britain, of the mother country, who is supposed to, who has protected their trade across the oceans, is also supposed to protect and their interest in North America. This also, on the other hand, is also connected with the broader global sort of conflict between Britain and France at this point, vying for influence both in Europe and across the globe. So what you will have here will be Britain will send troops to fight the interest of the colonies. Some of the colonists will join as militiamen. Some of the colonies will become members of the British Army, like George Washington famously. Yeah, who was an officer in the British Army, and because that was their army, right? And eventually the British will win. The British will win this conflict, and it will end with the peace of Treaty of Paris in 1763. Now, it's important to pay attention to this because let's pay attention to this date here, 1763. Well, and realize, I invite you to realize that this is 10 short years before the Declaration of Independence. So what's gonna happen in 10 short years, basically 10, 12 years, yeah? That will move from we're fighting a war against the French and the Indians because this is the interest of the colonies, to the colonies suddenly rejecting the very country that to which they belonged and which has fought a war for them. Yeah. So this is the process, and as I said, it happens over a short period of time and with great intensity. So we're going to have to examine why this happened. What are some of the factors that lead to this happening? One of the first factors will be this war. And why? Because what do we know about wars? Yeah. Well, we know about wars that they cost money. Yeah. And how do governments obtain that money? The governments obtain that money by extracting them from their population through taxes. Yeah. But at this point, the colonies, remember, were not taxed directly by Britain. Yeah. So most of the money that went into fighting this war were extracted and paid by the population of Britain. Yeah. Now there's a problem with extracting, this amount of resources, because there's a limit to how much you can keep extracting before you turn the population against you. And again, we go back to again this important date. Because 1763, because if you know anything of world history, this is a short, 30-something years, 30-odd years, or even less, before one of the most momentous events in French history and world history, which will be the French Revolution. The French Revolution, which will change the face of France forever. And many people say famously that France has still not recovered from the French Revolution, which will erase an entire sort of way of being, physically as well, a lot of bloodshed. So a brutal, gigantic event that will erase an entire, civilization in a way of, in the sense of how they lived, and would transform it into something else, and which will be caused by the fact that the French government was involved in so many wars that it kept putting taxes on its population, that they alienated their population, which revolted against them. Yeah. So when we're talking about fighting these wars, we're talking about an expense of resources that is incredible. I mean, even today, fighting wars across overseas, we all know costs incredible amounts of money. Yeah. And they're not, some that are not really bearable after a certain point, even today. Now this is what, 200-300 years ago, yeah? So you can imagine that, they face the same challenges. And unlike the French, the British government was smart enough to say, let's manage this, because if we keep recklessly taxing our population, it's all gonna crumble. The French didn't do this, and it crumbled. Yeah. So I'm just pointing out the importance of these pressures and of these issues, and also to point out that the measures that we will talk in a second about, you will see that, well, you will start understanding why they were passed, because if we were to list the number, what were the factors. What were the factors that sort of led to this break? To this gigantic radical transformation in a short 10 years to move from colonies to independent statehood, and as we discussed, we need to list to identify these factors, and I will group them in several categories. First, there will be measures and responses. Measures meaning legal measures, legal decisions, laws passed, decision taken by the British government, so British measures, and responses from the colonies, and and the way these interacted, and the way they were passed, and the way these happened, led to an escalation of that break, or that led eventually to a breakup, right? So there's a series of measures, some of them, even if justified, perhaps not passed in the wisest of ways, and rather responses from the colonies that were perhaps exaggerated, perhaps unjustified, or perhaps justified, but it's this escalation that will contribute to that happening, what will happen, yeah? So one of the first measures, but it all starts with, the French Indian War. One of the first measures was the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 was a measure passed by the British government, by which, and this map shows it, yeah, this is the Proclamation line of 1763, by which the British government forbade the colonies from further expanding beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So they drew a line to more or less their current reach, yeah, and it corresponded with the Appalachian Mountains. So it's so good we can use this geographical form to kind of stop them from expanding. Why? Because it wanted to stop having to deal with conflicts with the Native Americans, but because of these continuous expanses that this entailed, that this would have entailed. Now, how did the colonies react to this? I would argue, or someone would argue, justified means measure by the British government. Obviously, they were intensely unhappy, yeah, because of what we just talked about, that the expansiveness, later we'll talk about, manifest destiny and all these things, that, it's, we have the right to expand, and this is key to our economic success. Remember what we just discussed, right? This was in their cultural DNA, yeah, in their ethos, into how they saw themselves, what they saw as key to their success and subsistence. So that clashed with their interests. So this will be one of the first measures that will anger the colonies. Then in 1764 you'll have the Sugar Act, which was a tariff. Now, what is a tariff? A tariff is a fee, right, on trade, yeah, or either import or export, yeah. That's a tariff. So it's not a tax. It's not a direct tax. It's basically, if you're importing, I don't know, cars from Japan, then you have to pay a fee, a tariff. Let's say even today, let's say, yeah. So this was a tariff on certain goods. As the name says to the Sugar Act, on sugar was one thing, but other goods as well, such as textiles, coffee, wines, and indigo dye, right? All of which were imported from within the British Empire. So, so there was a tariff on this because why? Because the Britain needed funds, right? So they put tariff on imports, which again is not outrageous. Every government puts such tariffs, yeah, on trade. That's the normal thing that the governments do today. But obviously the colonies were unhappy, especially those in the northeastern colonies, right? Whose money was made through trade, yeah. And remember, I mentioned the fact that they could trade up to recently. A lot of their trade was done irregularly, right? Sort of bypassing the regulations of the British Empire because it just didn't have the will or the wherewithal or whatever to enforce its rules. So basically, the colonies could trade freely, yeah. So okay, well now they're enforcing trade rules, which is any government does, but now that hurts the interests of the merchants in the northeastern colonies. Merchants who, remember, normally would be some of the strongest supporters of the British Empire because they benefit from its existence and from trade within the British Empire. Also in 1764 you have the Currency Act, by which the government in Britain forbade the colonies from emitting their own paper bills, their own paper tender. Now remember that at this time you don't have one central bank like today, which emits and controls all the influx of money. You have many currencies, and each colonies could produce, or different banks could produce their own currencies. And also there was the British-made currencies. By stopping them producing their own currencies, this was a way to control the monetary policy. Remember, when you produce too much currency on the market, there's inflation, whatever. But it hurt again the economic interests of some of the colonies, because because at a certain point currency became scarce, and you cannot become rich if there's no actual money that you can own, right? Because when the amount of currency that you can amass is limited, so it impeded their enrichment and commerce and whatever. 1765, there's another piece of legislation, the Stamp Act, and this, pay attention, this Stamp Act will be the first direct tax on the population of the colonies. First. And how does it happen? Well, today, how do you pay taxes? You pay taxes to the federal government from each paycheck. They extract something from the paycheck, and also once a year, by April 15, you need to do a tax declaration and to pay a percentage of your income, right? That's your tax, yeah? Why does the current government, why is it able to do that? Because it has the institution and the system and the technology to know what your income is. So you have those paychecks, yeah? It's all computerized, blah, blah, blah. They can track you down, unless you're paid under the table, so to speak, or with no papers, or they can track you down in terms of your income, and IRS can come after you and so on. Now, there was no such system of institutions for the British government to be able to see how rich was every member of the colony. The way this could have been done, or would be done, let's say in Britain, would be like, okay, it's by how the tax on houses, or how big the house is, or how big your fields, your properties are. So it's a tax on property because that's measurable. Income is hard to measure, and you don't know how much money actually one person has because you don't have payrolls and paychecks and so on. So what was the way for the British government to be able to extract some direct payments from the population of the colonies? Through stamps. So basically every printed material in the colonies had to now bear a stamp, and you would buy this stamp from basically the British government, and it was the cost of the stamp that was the tax that you were paying. I mean, if you think of it, that wasn't that much. Yeah. And with all of this, at this point, the colonists comparatively, like, this is the first direct tax on the colonies. The rest were tariffs. How many people did trade with internationally, right? Only those people paid tariffs, right? So how much were actually the colonies hurt by these taxes and so on? Not much, in fact. In fact, comparatively, the population of Britain paid 26 times more in taxes than the population of the colonies. Taxes and tariffs. 26 times more, yeah? So they were bearing the brunt of all of the adventures like the French and Indian War and so on. And again, I'm giving you this information to kind of see were these measures justified, but also even if they're justified, and arguably they were, um, legislative measures are not just passed because they make sense. They need to be passed when you pass legislative measures. This is true for any government. There is also an evaluation of the capacity of the population on which you're imposing these measures to bear that measure. Yeah. Today we have opinion polls, we have lobbying, we have all of this. There's always a back and forth in which before passing a law, generally they kind of feel it out. Yeah. Is this going to be accepted? There needs to be a certain degree of okay. Yeah. Because the danger is, you can pass as many laws as you want. If you break a certain barrier, if you overburden the population, the law will not be effective. Because overall, what makes a law effective is not enforcement, is acquiescence. Is the fact that the population willingly acquiesces to that law, also with the threat of punishment, but it's not as bad or as hurtful so that they have no other choice but to revolt, as it happened in the French Revolution. So anyway, so the Stamp Act, that was the Stamp Act. And also in 1765 you have the Quartering Act, which required the colonies to host and to feed British troops. Well, they came to fight your wars. How about you also contribute to their sustenance, right, to keeping them up? I mean, you can't just, come when we need you and then, leave or whatever, right, immediately thereafter. So again, you see that these measures, we kind of see why they were passed, right? However, as I said, it's not just passing measures, but it's how you pass the measures and also how they're received and how they're interpreted. Because, for example, famously the Stamp Act was the act that resulted in the famous call, no taxation without representation. And where did this come from? This came from the fact that these colonies, remember, they were British, yeah? They were British, and part of Britishness was the principle of, as I said, of representation. And as we discussed earlier, the population of the colonies was represented, the population of each colony, in their own assembly. They, however, did not have representation in the parliament in Britain. However, it was the parliament in Britain that passed the piece of legislation that imposed taxes on them, like the Stamp Act. Yeah? So we're not represented here, so you shouldn't have the right to pass to extract taxes from us because we're not represented there. That was a British idea. In most countries, this wouldn't be even an argument because in most countries, the citizens, the people, had no such rights. It wasn't like, I need to be represented there in order for them to be able to tax me, right? So notice how important Britishness is, right? To even make the argument later for secession, because they build the whole argument on the rights of a British person, yeah? So no taxation without representation was only our assembly where we are represented should have the right to tax us directly. So that's the messaging. So there's measures and responses. Other factors that will contribute will be certain events. Events that you have heard of, that are famous, and I'm going to mention in 1770 the famous Boston Massacre. Yeah, the Boston Massacre. Again, pay attention to the name, right? Key events. Where again, what is important is not necessarily exactly what happens, but how that event is interpreted. So, for example, the Boston Massacre. What was it? It was a group of colonists, a small group, some of which had a little bit much to drink, started throwing rocks, snowballs with rocks, at armed British soldiers. Yeah. Okay, picture the scene. This is in Boston. Yeah. Now, put it in today's context. Yeah, what would happen if you would start throwing rocks at armed cops? Yeah? Or what would happen, you go to the next army base, and you go to the armed guards and start throwing rocks at them. What will happen? Yeah? Nothing good will come of this. So what comes out of this is that the soldiers will respond. They will start, they will start shooting. 5 people will die. 8 will be injured. Yeah, massacre. Remember? Yeah. And the British soldiers will be put on trial because they shot and killed certain a number of people. And who will defend them? But future famous political leader of the United States and independence leader, John Adams, who was a lawyer there, and who defended them successfully because they were provoked, and they are exonerated because, well, again, what happens if you attack some soldiers in the next army base with rocks? Or what happens if you attack police officers with rocks? Okay. So, this is the event. But how does it remain known as the Boston Massacre? Now, why is this important? Although already I'm sure you understand. Because it's not just, what happens, as I said. It's how it is interpreted. Because slowly but surely you'll have a group of opinion leaders, of elites, who will start pushing towards this idea of separation. But it's very hard to make this point when the case is that your identity is British, yeah, and you also have some other dimensions, but it's all one. It's a mix. It's intertwined. I'm British, but also have some particularities. So how do you move from that to, oh no, we're something else, we need to separate, we need to part? And as I said, these measures and counter responses, these events, and especially how they are interpreted, will contribute to what's very important in the formation of a picture of an us versus them. Because, at this point we were all us. Now, how do we create an us that is different from them? What is it that unites? What is it that unites a group of people more than anything else? Well, obviously a common enemy. So creating the image of a common enemy will be key, right? Will be key in defining an us versus them, in separating creating a distinct identity, a distinct claim for and claiming a different identity or a different path, right, from what we just are or were as British who just fought a war against the French and Indians, held by the British Army. So the Boston Massacre is one of these key events because it's still known, right? The echoes still reverberate, all through grade school and civics classes, right? People are taught this, yeah. Because massacre means very clearly that there's one side that does the massacring and the other side that is massacred, that there's an us and there's a them, and they are the aggressors. You see how important these things are. The other event, another event that was also key in this, and you all know about it in 1770, what was 1773, I think. Just trying to be, 1770, trying to be precise, was the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, right, also remains well known. Now, what was it about, again? Because what it remains known as is one thing. So, a group of colonists who wanted to, who were on the side of, separating from Britain, dressed as Native Americans, jumped on British commercial ships and dumped the tea that they have brought in overboard into the water, creating damages probably in today's currency millions of dollars. Yeah, so it was an act of sabotage, even terrorism we could call it. Yeah, in the sense of destroy something impressive. Terrorism is when you do an act that creates creates a lot of damage and scares the population in order to achieve political ends, political results, political change. And that's kind of what it was. Now, why did this happen? Yeah. Well, usually you would say, and people know generally from what they heard and in grade school, as I said, is that because of taxes on tea. Well, that's actually false, or partially true. Because what was true is that the taxes on imported tea that was brought by British merchant ships, that tea was not taxed. So the market was flooded by cheap tea brought by British commercial ships. The tea imported by local merchants from the northeastern colonies was taxed, so it was more expensive. So this was a measure which hurt the interest of those who traded in tea. Well, how many were they? Clearly not the majority of the population. Yeah. So it's like, okay, if a bunch of rich people who trade are going to complain that, oh, it's harder for me to trade, most of the people would say, who cares? Yeah. If as I said, Jeff Bezos complains that he's lost $1 billion from his 60 billion or 600 billion or how much he has, nobody will care. Yeah. But so what was the argument? Well, actually, the cheap tea that they brought in and the fact that so much cheap tea was coming in, the rhetoric was that they're trying to buy our subjectness, to buy our subordination. They're bribing us into being their subjects. Well, you know, I mean, I don't see many people going to Walmart and protesting the low prices, yeah? Right? Because normally the population is happy to pay as little as possible, yeah? But it's again how you put it. And because they couldn't say, well, people don't buy cheap tea from India, yeah, I'm gonna buy it. He's gonna say, don't buy it because they're trying to buy our subjection through that cheap tea. Kind of a weird argument. So that's what this was. What this was about. Because again, the taxes on tea is like, how many people were hurt by this? However, speaking of hurt, a lot of these measures, as I said, this tax and that and the other, was hurt parts of the population of the colonies that some of these portions of the population used to be the biggest supporters of the British, of belonging to Britain, because they were British. I'm talking about the merchants. I'm talking about the southern planters, and so this was this is when I said that some of these measures, even if they were justified, were not passed wisely. Yeah. For example, you could have reserved some seats in the parliament in Britain to some of the members of the colonies. Now, it wasn't done at that time, so it would have been like a genius, whoever would have come up with that measure. Because today it's done. Like today in the parliament of Italy, for example, there are seats reserved for people of Italian descent from South America and from North America, US and Canada. Yeah. So people who live overseas, who are born overseas, of Italian descent, have representation in the parliament in Italy. So it's done today. But it's a very recent thing, from literally like the last 20, 25 years, that this has become a practice around the world. Now, but I'm just saying that things could have been done differently. Now, also with the Boston Tea Party, the goal of them doing this act of sabotage, of terrorism, and creating such gigantic damages and hurting the commercial interests of the British merchants was to force. The goal of these people who did the Boston Tea Party was to force the British government to take some radical measures, and they did. In response to the Boston Tea Party, to this act of sabotage, maybe terrorism, they shut down the legislature, the Assembly of Massachusetts, instated direct government by the governor appointed by the monarch, so further escalated the situation, which is what they wanted, these Boston Tea Partiers. Okay, so we have certain events and interpretation of events. We have propaganda, and by which I don't mean something negative or positive. I just mean, this concerted effort to propagate, yeah, certain ideas or a certain point of view. So clearly directed at convincing people about a certain thing, yeah, propaganda. It's about propagating, yeah, an idea. And the way it was done, this was mostly through pamphlets that were distributed and that made the argument for separation. Like famously, Thomas Paine's Thomas Paine's pamphlet, essay, Common Sense, which contains the famous phrase, "'Tis time to part." Not to party, but to part. Yeah, which pieces of rhetoric that were very powerful. Yeah, to convince the people of the necessity for separating from Britain, because again, it was hard, and just like today, this is a huge territory from Massachusetts to Maine, Massachusetts to Georgia, right? Even today is a gigantic territory. So how do you create a current of opinion behind the common idea? So propaganda, spreading, making the case, powerfully. It is time to part. There will be other, such key buzzwords, just like taxation without representation, right? It's very important to make to create these buzzwords, this propaganda to support this idea, to convince people, yeah, that it's an us versus them, and we can only go one way. There's only one way out, yeah. Then the other thing, propaganda, as I said, is another factor, another tool, and again, I don't mean in the wrong way, just creating a current of opinion in a certain way. Organizing, i.e. what? Creating institutions, yeah, that would support the whole impetus towards separation. And famously, you have all these organizations that will form in every colony, or most colonies, like the Sons of Liberty, and whatever, all kinds of cool names that because it's important. Again, rhetoric is important, and Sons of Liberty sounds good, right? Even later, remember, we're talking about patriots and loyalists. Well, which one sounds better? Anyway, so Sons of Liberty, which will be like cells of people of the same opinion, organized in different colonies, who could agitate in each colony to create a current of opinion in support of this. Other forms of organization would be the first Continental Congress, that's in 1774, and the Second Continental Congress, which will take place in 1775-6, over the winter. Which will be what? Which will be gatherings of delegates from each of these colonies. Delegates, but they weren't elected, yeah? They were part of the local elites, yeah? Maybe part of the local political elites, local commercial elites, and so on, who got, obviously mostly leaning in one specific direction, who met, and this is the important part, that they're called the Continental Congress. First of all, Continental Congress, already the name should raise eyebrows, because what do you mean continental? Because you're representing, if anything, these colonies, and not even that, right? But they're saying, no, we're the Continental Congress. You can kind of see how they see themselves in the future. Again, this impetus towards expansion, like this continent is ours just to conquer, right? To expand. And delegates, as I said, from these colonies, because you need to form an institution to be able to speak with a common voice. Yeah. So when they said Continental Congress, it could have been called the 13 Colonies Congress. Congress means assembly, gathering. Yeah, it's the gathering of representatives of the colonies. Yeah. So that's what Congress means: gathering of something, congregating. Yeah. So when they call themselves the Continental Congress, it's a very highfalutin name for basically the gathering of the representatives of 13 colonies, well, delegates from 13 colonies. And it's important because these institutionalizing this way, they are able to speak with one voice and to again creating the institutional basis for an I, for an us. Yeah, because us now. Who is us? Well, here's the gathering of the delegates from all the colonies. There is an us. There is an institutionalized us, yeah, that talks to them who have massacred us, yeah. So these institutionalized forms of speaking with one voice, even if they didn't actually represent the population, because nobody did an opinion poll of the whole population what they wanted, yeah, is very powerful, because this is the next step. This is the only way to do something as in common, right? To create an institution that represents or speaks for us in common. And finally, so organizing is an important thing, creating institutions. Institutions of, us, yeah? And then finally, war. And of course, this is key, because the moment the conflict starts, the dialogue stops. Like the definition of war is in many ways, is in many ways that it's what happens when the dialogue, when the conversation stops. So you always need to maintain conversation. Later on, when we have the civil war, it will all start with the representatives of the southern states leaving the US Congress, so that there's no more conversation. So conflicts that are inevitable are no longer solved through conversation, through dialogue, through argument, but are solved through violent conflict. And another thing that war does, first of all, it ends conversation. It's obviously, a war inevitably comes with bloodshed, with victims. And bloodshed inevitably leads to escalation, right? Because someone, there's just an encounter and a few people die. Oh, suddenly it's a massacre. We need to kill some of them. Oh, some of them are killed. And also, there's nothing like war to clearly differentiate the us versus them, to clearly differentiate the image of an enemy. So starting a war was sort of the last straw that broke the camel's back, because there's not much space to back down, and this is clearly a way to define an us versus a them. Yeah. So all of these factors will lead to the Second Continental Congress, asking Thomas Jefferson to write a document that will be called the Declaration of Independence, and for the Second Continental Congress to pass this, to approve and pass this declaration, meaning these delegates, to pass this declaration, and by which they will claim the right to become, from 13 colonies to become 13 states. But we will discuss in detail the Declaration of Independence in the next class. We'll dedicate the entire class, assuredly, to discussing the Declaration of Independence. Thank you, and I will see you in the next class.